Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. In a few hours, just after sundown, Erev Yom Kippur begins. Happy Yom Kippur to our Jewish communities who couldn't join us today. I wish you all and bear with me, Juma Hatema Tova, an easy fast and a meaningful new year. We have noted our apology for scheduling this event so close to the beginning of your religious observance. Thank you for understanding. I'm Kiki Edozie, currently serving as the interim dean for the McCormick School of Policy and Global Studies. And for the first time in our school's history of putting on these events, I'd like to I'm so excited, actually, to be co-hosting the event with the school's student success student ambassadors, especially Jayden Panvo, if you could stand up, please, who is the student chair of the Dean's Office Student Success Ambassador Group, and she will address you in a minute. But I'd like to say that at McCormick this year, by leveraging the global diversity of our students who embody tremendous cultural wealth drawn from local, national, regional, and international domains. Our 3 departments and 14 academic programs will provide a rigorous and inclusive academic environment that supports our students' intellectual growth and career preparation this year. But first, I'd like to say welcome, welcome, welcome to academic year 22-23. Almost 40 years ago, a then young political scientist in the College of Liberal Arts, McCormick's founder, Edward Beard, established the John McCormack Institute of Public Affairs in April 1983. As an applied policy research center with equally important public service and public affairs educational components. Beard's agenda was not only the innovation of the traditional political science discipline, where he expanded and deepened the discipline to become the interdisciplinary practice of policy and public affairs programming that we do today. Robert Woodbury, a former director of the John McCormack Institute of Public Affairs, outlined the Institute's impact then as follows. It would lead in serving as an independent analyzer, in educating and training public servants, in being a catalyst on important public issues of the day, in devising permanent mechanisms to modernize state government, in empowering new civic constituencies, and in enhancing governance on a global scale. Another important trait that defines McCormick's legacy is our beginnings with powerful patrons and entrepreneurial leadership. Next slide, please. Building on the internship that Edmund Beard had established as a professor for a Umass Boston student in the Speaker's Office of the U.S. House of Representatives, Beard went on to develop links with key staff and congressmen, Tip O'Neill. Beard proposed to him a line item, earmarked expenditure in tribute to former Speaker John W. McCormack, who approved a $3 million endowment to another congressman and successor in McCormick's district, Joseph Moakley. And in 1991, Congressman Joseph Moakley facilitated another $3 million appropriation for the McCormick Institute's endowment to expand its portfolio in international public affairs. To this end, John W. McCormack's biographer, Garrison Nelson, wrote that the creation of the John McCormack Institute of Public Affairs not only honors McCormack's record, but also recognizes the University of Massachusetts Boston as a center for excellence in policy studies. That is why, in 1993, a UMass Boston chancellor, the late Sherry Penny, would call the McCormick School, which represents, she said, a perfect model of the way that universities can successfully integrate scholarship with public service. This marvelous center of excellence is an intellectual engine of great magnitude, which has made and will continue to make, she said, a powerful contribution to the building of a better and a more just and equitable society. In 2003, almost 20 years ago, the John McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies is founded with Edmund Beard as its interim dean. Let me stop here and jump right to the present. Who are we at the McCormick School 20 to 40 years later? That's the question that we as faculty, students, community friends, and administrators want to think about as we embody these histories while also charting new commitments for transformation at the school this academic year. Today, we recognize Provost Joe Berger, who, with Chancellor, has launched 6 new strategic priorities for UMass Boston, including holistic student success, 4 the city, and 4 grand scholarly challenges. Our founders have positioned us well for strategic priority 1 for the city in cultivating a diverse workforce and engaged citizenry, creating cross-disciplinary knowledge and scholarship, promoting social and economic mobility for Boston's residents, and supporting and strengthening local institutions and sectors that elevate our communities. Our strengthened partnership with our DOS ambassadors and our students more generally is also a first step for McCormick in demonstrating our commitment to holistic student success and putting McCormick students at the forefront of McCormick's comprehensive agenda. We will facilitate equitable academic outcomes for our students, enhance their career planning, recognize their cultural wealth, and deepen their student engagement required for the success. Our welcome keynote speakers embody the university's new strategic commitments. Joe Kennedy III, whose new exciting work at Groundwork Project and Citizens Energy in saving our democracy, facilitating economic equity, and advancing climate change inform our own public affairs and services agenda significantly. Our alumna, Dr. Sudeshna Chatterjee, is a 2021 graduate of our PhD program in global governance and human security. Today, she is the Town of Reading's Director for Equity and Social Justice. Welcome again, everyone. I look forward to a year where we strengthen our school's current mission to use public affairs and policy and public service to tackle contemporary global challenges that serve the public good. Welcome again, and let's kick this off. Thank you. I'm going to invite, thank you, Provost Joe Berger to provide some welcoming comments as well. I'd just like to do him due justice. Joseph B. Berger is UMass Boston's current provost and vice chancellor of academic affairs. He served as dean of UMass Boston's College of Education and Human Development previously. Joe is a renowned and award-winning scholar whose work focuses on higher education policy, organization, and leadership, the impact of higher education on stakeholders, and the development of higher education in various national contexts. He has authored dozens of journal articles, book chapters, and research reports, and has served on several editorial boards for several top journals. He has received more than $62 million in funding for his work from agencies and foundations such as the National Science Foundation, the United States Agency for International Development, the Treffler Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Nellie Mae Educational Foundation. I would say more, but time does not permit. Please, Provost Joe Berger, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Dean Edozie, for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure and a thrill to be with you here today. You know, and Dean Edozie did a great job of setting the stage, right, with the history of the McCormick School for Policy and Global Studies and how we got to where we are today. And I just want to take a few moments to say something about not so much where we are now, but the future and where we're going. And the future here begins with our students. So first and foremost, I want to welcome and congratulate all of the students here for being part of what is truly a remarkable academic community in the McCormick School. This is a school that is founded on the principles and values of democracy, of equity, sustainability, justice, and peace. As we look at where we are now, not just here at UMass Boston, but in our local communities, in the nation, and the world, these are values that are needed to drive action and impact more than ever before. The co-creation of knowledge, the dissemination of that knowledge, but the engagement with individuals and communities through the use of rigorous, evidence-based, factual knowledge at a time when truth is often under assault is incredibly important. And the McCormick School provides a powerful forum for advancing that agenda. And we're very fortunate to have such dedicated, talented, and skilled faculty and staff. But it's not just the faculty and staff who are creating, disseminating, sharing knowledge that create a platform for learning and impact. It is the students who come to us from local communities, from all over the country, and indeed the world, that learn from and with each other, that while learning with and from the faculty and staff also help us to better understand how our talents and expertise can best be applied and advanced. The future leaders of our local communities, nation, and world are here at McCormick. And so you're building on a strong foundation of success, but it is the future that matters. And so I'm thrilled, again, to be here with all of you, to be a proud member of your community that uplifts not just UMass Boston, but the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts and beyond. And that there's great challenge before all of us. It's a privilege to be a part of a community like this. And I am confident that together we can make the kind of impact for which we aspire. As Dean Edozie noted, we just launched last week our new 10-year strategic plan for the times, and certainly the McCormick School is a school that is for the times. There is an important future ahead of us, and the McCormick School will play an important role in advancing the strategic plan and advancing the role that UMass Boston has in the world. And I think it's particularly appropriate and fitting that we have the Honorable Joe Kennedy III here, who has been a public servant, leader, and champion of the very values that define who we are and define the mission and the work of the McCormick School. So without further ado, I'll turn it back over to Dean Dozie to introduce our keynote speaker and guest of honor. But thank you again to all of you for choosing to be part and for contributing to the incredibly vibrant and powerful community that is the McCormick School. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Provost Berger. Now I have the incredible, excited role to introduce another Joe, Joe Kennedy III. Joseph Kennedy III has dedicated his career to social and economic justice, fighting for the basic needs of every American family and a political system that is inclusive, representative, and fair. As the U.S. representative of Massachusetts' 4th Congressional District from 2013 to 2021, he ran for office on this mandate to tackle the systemic inequities from healthcare and housing to climate and education that have left countless American families locked out and left behind. He's a former Peace Corps member, legal aid volunteer, and assistant district attorney. He has worked tirelessly for the people most at risk, most marginalized, and most in need. Over his 4 terms in the House of Representatives, Joe Kennedy emerged as a national figure in the Democratic Party's most pivotal debates, while demonstrating a unique talent for building diverse coalitions and the political will to get things done. He is the founder of Groundwork Project, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting local community organizing efforts in communities that do not receive the investment that they deserve. Kennedy is also currently the managing director of At Citizens Energy, a nonprofit energy company founded in 1979 by his father, Joseph P. Kennedy II, who is also a Beacon alum. Under its innovative business model, Citizens builds major energy infrastructure projects while serving the needs of low-income and frontline communities. Joe Kennedy III serves on numerous nonprofit boards, including Woodwell Climate Research Center, the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, right here on the peninsula, and he is the special advisor to the Poor People's Campaign. He attended Stanford University and Harvard Law School and spent 2 years in the United States Peace Corps in the Dominican Republic. He is married to Lauren Birchfield Kennedy, and they have 2 young children, Eleanor and James, and a rescue dog named Banjo. Please join me in welcoming Joe Kennedy III. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. How are we doing? Good. Madam Dean, thank you so much for the kind introduction, the incredible vision that you've brought to UMass Boston over the course of the past year, for the extraordinary contributions that you've made in the larger field of public policy and public service over the course of your career. I'm grateful to spend some time with you this afternoon as well. We did an interview for your radio show, which was a great conversation, and you've just been very generous with your welcome as always, so thank you very much. It's wonderful to be back on campus. Provost Berger, thank you very much for having me as well, for extending the invitation, and for your truly global leadership in the field of higher education. Dr. Chatterjee, wonderful to share the stage with you this evening as well. Wonderful to be with you. Look forward to your comments, and thank you for coming back once again to UMass Boston. And hello, everybody. I realize that it is a little bit late in the day. You guys are starting something new. It has probably been a long day for all of you, and it is about 48 degrees and drizzle outside, which is like perfect. So I have a couple of comments here to start to kind of frame my take on part of the topic of our conversation, and then look forward to jumping into a conversation with all of you and making this much more of a discussion, hopefully answering as many questions as we possibly can before I get kicked out and you get to hear from Dr. Chatterjee. So, sound all right? Hopefully. If it doesn't sound all right, you're still stuck with it, so there you go. So, in all seriousness, everybody, this is one of our nation's premier institutions of public service and a crown jewel of the city of Boston. To all of you in the audience today, choosing to dedicate your life, your education, to the big challenges are the heart of McCormick's mission and its curriculum: justice, peace, equity, and democracy. It's never been calling for the faint of heart. But in this moment, one of such upheaval and global reckoning, it is particularly fearless work. So I thank all of you for being here today, for showing up in this fight. And I say that very intentionally, because it is a fight, and everything is on the line. And for committing yourself to the very things that will ensure that this country and our globe's better angels prevail. Truly and deeply, thank you. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about democracy. To do that, I want to talk about water pipes. And I'd ask you to bear with me as I take you about 1,500 miles away from here to Mississippi. Mississippi, as some of you know, is the blackest state in our country. It is also the poorest state in our country, a place that marks some of the most consequential chapters in America's history books, home to civil rights titans like Fannie Lou Hamer and Medgar Evers, setting for some of the most searing moments of the civil rights era: the lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till, the Freedom Rides, and Freedom Summer. A place where my grandfather, Senator Robert Kennedy, took a history-making tour of the Mississippi Delta in 1967, where he saw poverty, the likes of which most Americans did not know existed in their country. Mississippi's capital is Jackson. It's home to about 150,000 residents today. Median household income is around $45,000 a year. 82% of the population of Jackson is black, making it the blackest major city in America. It's called the City of Soul. It is a vibrant, striving cultural place accustomed to fighting for its future, with a legacy of organizing that is so rich, so fierce, that it is impossible to imagine where our country would be today without the history makers, many of whose names we know, and many more who we don't, that have called that city home. Now, many of you, maybe all, have seen the headlines out of Jackson over the course of the past several months. Last month, its water treatment facility failed, leaving residents of a major American capital without running water to flush their toilets for a full week. When the water came back, most residents were under a boil water notice for weeks. The most horrifying part about all of that is that it is, in fact, nothing new. Many of you remember similar headlines this past winter, when an unprecedented winter storm ravaged the city, bursting pipes and again leaving residents without access to drinking water for an entire month. The EPA estimates that there have been over 300 boil water notices issued in the last 2 years alone for the city of Jackson. But for generations, Jackson has experienced a profound disinvestment in basic goods and services. 4 decades of population loss, a shrinking tax base, federal and state neglect, and a legacy of Jim Crow and segregation and white supremacy stealing dollars meant for a majority black city and sending them to wealthier, whiter communities across the state. The result? Dirty water, rusted pipes, broken sidewalks, entire neighborhoods that report raw sewage bubbling up on their front lawns because of crumbling infrastructure. So imagine for a second that you're a resident of Jackson, Mississippi today. You turn on the faucet this afternoon and you find brown, brackish water spewing out. You call the city, the mayor's office. They try to help. Maybe they can fix the pipe in question in that moment. But they can't fix an underlying issue, which is a $2 billion problem, which is what local experts estimate it would take to repair Jackson's drinking and sewage systems. So you look to your state government, led by Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves, whose response to the latest water crisis was to mock the city at an event in another community, saying, "It is a great day to not be in Jackson," from the governor of the state, who has in past bragged about blocking money for water infrastructure updates, and who has had this suggestion to offer the city government do a better job of collecting water bill payments, as if you could somehow squeeze $2 billion out of 150,000 people who have a median household income of less than $50,000 a year. And, by the way, a governor who sits at the helm of a state government that has made national headlines of late for continuing to reject Medicaid dollars for Medicaid expansion, and instead redirecting millions of dollars, welfare dollars, intended for the neediest, to Brett Favre and other celebrities. Jackson then asked the Mississippi State Legislature for $47 million to respond to its water crisis in the immediate aftermath of that winter storm. You know how much they got? $3 million. They got $3 million for a $2 billion problem. So, as the Jackson resident with that rusted water in your pipes, and a city government who can't help, and a state government who won't, you might be starting to feel pretty hopeless. But you think that your federal government might then step in. It did, after all, just pass a big infrastructure bill that is designed to mitigate crises like this one. And that bill will no doubt help. It has $450 million earmarked for water improvements across the entire state of Mississippi, But remember, it is a $2 billion problem for Jackson alone. So your elected representatives are starting to feel like a dead end. And that's disheartening. But luckily, you live in a country that has the option of direct referendum, ballot initiatives. Citizens can petition to get local policy reforms on their local ballots, and the people can then vote. One problem in Mississippi. The Mississippi Supreme Court struck down the state's ballot initiative process earlier this year. And in order to revive it, guess what you have to do? You have to go through that state legislature. Guess what they have not been in a hurry to do? Fix that ballot initiative process. But you still have your voice and you still have your vote. But not so much if you happen to be black in Mississippi, where you will face some of the most aggressive voter suppression tactics anywhere in this country. They are quite literally written into law. When the state constitution was crafted by former Confederates at the end of Reconstruction, the number of black residents eligible to register to vote in Mississippi went from 67% to 6%. Now, today, it's a lot better than that, but plenty of obstacles still remain. Today, if you're convicted of minor crimes ranging from writing one bad check to timber larceny, which, think about timber larceny for a second, who steals timber and why? You steal timber to heat your home when it's cold. If you're convicted of timber larceny, you lose your right to vote for life. So at this point, if you're a resident of Jackson, Mississippi, you've got to be asking, what on God's green earth has democracy done for me? Today, that is a question that echoes far outside Mississippi. We hear it in Flint, Michigan, another black city with poison water. We hear it in Laredo, Texas, where healthcare and education rivals developing world nations. We hear it in Massachusetts, if you listen closely, where our education and healthcare and technology sectors lead the nation, but in communities like Brockton and Lawrence, Holyoke, struggle to get the resources they need to keep their residents housed and safe and employed. So that frustration, that anger, that hopelessness, it pulses through political systems and modern governments the world over, forcing a populace rightfully incensed that meeting basic needs grows ever more impossible by the day, while the very rich and very powerful set new records for extravagance. It is a global democratic phenomenon. We have seen yellow vests swarm Parisian roads. 1.2 million take to the streets of Santiago, Chile. Tens of thousands of Indian farmers marched from Punjab to Delhi. Upwards of 20 million flood American neighborhoods in protest, begging to let black men breathe. These fights are not all the same, and the stakes are not all equal. But the collective global anger and anguish at the inability of so many citizens in democratic countries to access basic freedoms and fundamentals of a good and decent life. It has unleashed a global reckoning. The far right has effectively seized on that exploding populist energy to undermine democracy. From January 6th at the US Capitol, to Bolsonaro in Brazil, Erdogan in Turkey, Lukashenko in Belarus, and plenty of others. Those who gain when democracy ails have found fodder in the fires of our frustration. So the question for the rest of us is, can we seize that energy to help renourish democracy instead? Because the truth is that democracies are suffering from rot. Today, we speak about that candidly. Most of our institutions were built by and for rich white men who hoarded rather than shared power. They've done more than just neglect places like Jackson, Mississippi. They've exploited and oppressed. And far too often, they have done the one very thing that democracy promised it would not: leave people behind. Realizing that fact and restoring that power is how we save democracy. Protests and public pressure are critical. Changing the narrative, reshaping a debate, refusing to let leaders look away. But for change to be lasting, you have to do more than challenge those who are in power. You have to fundamentally change who has power in a system to begin with. We have to regressively reform sacred institutions that have been allowed to become anti-democratic, or that weren't really all that democratic in the first place. An electoral college, our Senate rules, our highest court. You have to ruthlessly prioritize public policy that meets basic human needs, because few can fight oppression when they are hungry or homeless or hurting, when they can't see past making their children get to school every day. And finally, perhaps most critically, but most often ignored, you have to restore civic power to people and places that have been excluded, overlooked, and left out. Because in a representative democracy, people have to be more than just bullhorns. They have to be able to realize their vote. That's the bitter irony of the far right's claim to populism. They respond with autocrats and small, strong men. whose solution is in fact a system that further restricts distribution of power, that doubles down on a corrupt elitism that they claim to fight against, that puts up more barriers to access power than fighting to extend it. The correct course is exactly the opposite. It's to build a system where no common man or woman needs a strong man to air their grievance or fight their battle, until those that are not just seen and heard but represented, our experiment will still struggle. So let me end these comments by taking us back to Jackson, Mississippi. My friend Corey Wiggins was the head of the Mississippi chapter of the NAACP for years. He was one of the premier racial justice and civil rights organizations in America. He was born and raised in rural Mississippi. Today, he spends every waking moment fighting to build a more just and equitable future in his home state. I was talking to him recently about the need to create better political infrastructure in Mississippi for Black and working class folks. To unclench white supremacy's grip, to give every resident a shot at opportunity, to make sure there's not sewage on your damn lawn when you wake up in the morning, and that if there is, that you have a system to fix it. And then he said to me, you have to understand, these systems and institutions were built not to work for us. Our work ahead, then, in democracy's name, is about more than repairing and healing, as is so often characterized. It is about breaking down and building new. It is a simple test. If we believe in the promise of democracy, despite all its warts and compromises, then are we willing to challenge it, to change it? We go back to the drawing board in some places, build a new foundation, and start over where it is broken down. That is a test for a generation, and it is yours to seize. May you have the grace and guts to do so, because our country, and plenty of others, are counting on you. Thanks so much for having me. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you again, Joe Kennedy. That was really passionate and inspiring, address. And really, you're spot on on the issues of the day. We agreed that we would have a moderated conversation.
Great.
To elaborate on some of the questions that we addressed earlier on today. But I do think some of our students do want to ask you questions as well. Is that okay? All right.
Yeah, if you don't have questions, I've got questions of you, so I'll start calling people out.
All right. So to everyone, I'll ask Joe a few questions on my mind, and then I'll reserve about 15 minutes or 20 minutes for you to think about questions to ask him yourself, and I'll give you the mic. Okay, I know the import of what you have just addressed is still on my mind, and I'm inclined to launch into a response to that. But I think I want to start with the lighthearted and say, happy birthday. Joe Kennedy agreed to address us today. Despite that, it is his birthday. And so happy birthday to you. Your Twitter account says that you are a former congressman from Massachusetts, but that you're also a tired and lucky dad. Can you elaborate on that part? A tired and lucky dad.
The tired and lucky dad, I think if there's any dads in the room, and moms in the room too, you would probably agree with me that it's amazing, but they're tiring, right? Like, it's just, they're 4 and 6, they're relentless, they're lovely, they have no empathy for anything, right? If you try to tell them you're tired, like, he just jumps on your head in the morning instead. Like, wake up. Like, that's not the appropriate response. He couldn't care. They're lovely little terrorists, but they are that. It is chaos every day at home, and it starts early and, ends when that part ends when they go to bed, and then you got to go back to work for a while. So very lucky. They're fantastic, and again, you all, I hope you all have lots of kids. If you want to try it out, I've got 2. You're welcome to them for a little while.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's launch into the import of your address today. I'm so glad that you started out with the recent case of the Jackson, Mississippi's water crisis. It's amazing to me that it's recent because just about 10 or 15 years ago, we had the Flint crisis in Michigan. I used to live in Michigan, and I thought we all said never again. And yet in 2022, we have the atrocious circumstances of what you have described in Jackson, Mississippi, which is, as you say, 82% black. So perhaps you could, link or elaborate on that case around your own concepts about sort of moral capitalism and eradicating inequalities from the ground up.
I'll try, Madam Dean. So I think a couple of things, right? One, as you alluded to, right, there's a number of challenges that many post-industrial cities are confronting with population change and population loss and infrastructure that was built for cities of a certain size that have now, with those population shifts, largely out of an industrial Midwest to other places. You've got infrastructure that is set for 1 million people, doesn't have 500,000 people using it. The tax base erodes, the ability to maintain that infrastructure or upkeep falls away, and now you've got a challenge, a crisis. That's a crisis, and that's a challenge, but that is very clearly not what happened here, right? And not what took place in Jackson, and not what has taken place in plenty of other places. And, the fact when you have so Mississippi is, I think many of you know, the poorest state in the country. I assume many of you are familiar with TANF, welfare program in the United States, that is for some of the neediest families. This population of Mississippi is about 3 million people. Anybody want to take a guess at how many families in Mississippi receive TANF?
Policy students?
3 million people, so not apples to orange, or not apples to apples, but out of 3 million people, how many families receive TANF? No one has a clue?
Anyone? A clue? Shout out? Half?
Okay. The answer is roughly 2,000. So out of the poorest state in the country, and 3 million people, 2,000 families receive TANF. And the reason for that is because Mississippi state authorities have so restricted the access to TANF funds that only 2,000 families qualify.
Wow.
So when you start putting these different pieces together, you start saying, well, how could that be and why could that be? And again, Mr. Wiggins, my friend who I referenced at the end, his statement, I think, hits it home. These systems were designed not to work for us. They were not designed. They were designed, it's not that they weren't designed for them to be included, it's that they were designed for them not to be. And so the traditional systems that you would have in place of being able to hold governance to account, governments to account, structures to account, just do not apply. And so where else do you go? And Madam Dean, the last piece I'd say on this, and I don't want to make this too political, but I will for now. When the Mississippi water crisis, the Jackson water crisis, was on the front page of newspapers just recently, there was an editorial from the Wall Street Journal that put the crisis very squarely on the blame for it on the shoulders of a young mayor, progressive mayor, who I believe is probably in his late 30s, very impressive young guy. But they basically said, this was a consequence of mismanagement, that the state legislature had appropriated roughly $100 or $150 million to try to fix this problem, that they hadn't managed it appropriately, and therefore that you have this crisis. Think about that for a second. Assuming those numbers are accurate, the Mississippi legislature provided $150 million to fix a $2 billion problem, and it didn't work, and so it is the mayor's fault. And that is across the broadsheet of the most influential conservative newspaper in the country, where if you're not an expert on Mississippi water infrastructure, you read that and say, how did that happen? Oh, that's how it happened. That is not how it happened. This is not something, this crisis predates that mayor's birth. That is not his fault and his problem. It is he who has to try to fix it. But this is where government is supposed to be able to provide the most basic necessity, which is clean water. And the fact that if you have sewage, it is removed from your house through a system and infrastructure that we paid to put in place. And so these systems are obviously interlinked, where the lack of the way a political process was designed to eliminate or limit political power and economic power has perpetuated the extent that which a state government and state legislature can, in fact, continue to succeed and not be held to account and not allocate resources to actually address that problem. If you mean to tell me that if that happened in Belmont, Massachusetts, does anybody think that that would be allowed to persist? It would never get that far because we would pay for it. Yet it has gotten that far over and over and over again, now for years, if not decades, and be allowed to persist because of the way that system is designed.
So you would describe Mississippi in your website for the Groundwork project as a battleground where the fight isn't over one candidate or one election, but over the survival of justice, equity, and democracy itself. These are places that we have gotten used to writing off. Are there forgotten communities in the state of Massachusetts?
Yeah, I think 100% and very clearly. So let me unpack that a little bit. When we use the term battleground in that context on the website. You guys have heard of political battlegrounds before? Yes, people are nodding. Some are completely tuned out. Mm-hmm. Yes, more or less. Sure, great. So normally when people say political battleground, they mean Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, the battleground states that define who wins a presidential campaign, right? That's the kind of common parlance. And that's true, right? Our point through our work, through this organization Groundwork project, is to say, if you take a step back and look at the fundamental rights that at least I believe are under threat in this moment, voting rights, women's rights, our ability to combat climate change and others, those are actually directly targeted from West Virginia v. EPA, that gutted the EPA, Dobbs case out of Mississippi, which I think you're all familiar with, and Shelby v. Holder, a case that gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, that undermined voting rights, that came out of Alabama. And by the way, a case being argued in front of the Supreme Court today about Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. From where? Alabama again. So when we think of the framing of, oh my gosh, these fundamental rights and truisms that we believe in are under attack, where are they under attack from? They're under attack from conservative strongholds where the accountability, the ability for a political left to hold them to account is not effective, does not exist or is not effective. And the combination of that consolidation of conservative political power at a state level and conservative power at a federal judicial level, Supreme Court and appellate courts, enable an end run around the federal policymaking process where women's rights could be dramatically eroded, abortion could be the right to abortion could be rescinded by a Supreme Court when Democrats actually had control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency. Right? Control of the presidency, control of the House, control of the Senate is actually irrelevant to that pathway moving forward because a conservative movement can do whatever they want irrespective of who has control of those branches. And so I very much believe this is a battleground in the true form of the definition of battleground, even if not dispositive of if you win Mississippi, do you win the presidential election? Although if a Democrat won Mississippi, he probably would, but that's another point. So that's I think was the first half of your question. I forgot the second half.
Well, I'll segue into a similar question. In terms of impact, you say that when it comes to creating sustainable and long-term progressive change, you ask the question, what is the most effective way to make an impact? So do you think that your work is making impact, especially as we are upon the midterm elections, or does the midterm elections have nothing to do with this or your work?
Look, elections matter, no doubt. I would rather have, again, my political leanings here, not a surprise, I don't think to anybody. I would rather have Democrats in control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency to be able to respond to some of these potential maneuvers by a conservative movement as effectively as we possibly can underneath the structures that exist. But the fact is that, as I said, some of these outcomes are going to happen irrespective of, or some of these pathways can be exploited irrespective of who controls the House, the Senate, and the presidency, Madam Dean. And so part of the question there is, from my perspective anyway, why does that happen? How does that happen? And what can be done to address it? And that happens largely because of a dramatic imbalance in political power in various places across our country. And the last half of the question now I remember, even in Massachusetts. And is political power uniform in Massachusetts? The answer to that is emphatically no, it is not, right? And there's complex reasons for that, but no, it is not uniform in the state either. And so, oddly enough, it manifests differently and the consequences are different. But the fact that there is not, that say the Boston suburbs are the areas that will in fact dictate who wins, that's where the majority of votes are in the state. Whoever wins those elections wins those communities, and the state is likely to win the next election, whatever election that is for, means that candidates will focus their attention on that area. And in fact, you can focus your attention there and neglect other parts of the South Coast or Western Massachusetts because it doesn't have the population or the turnout rates. So when you look at how power is concentrated, you can then see what the results of that concentration bring. And from my perspective, that misallocate or that dramatic imbalance in political power has profound consequences for the health of our democracy. And so what we're trying to do is start the process by which that can be leveled or evened. And you can't do that wholly by restricting some. You have to do that by growing it elsewhere. And that's what Groundwork's up to.
Thank you. I think we have one question online.
Hello, we actually have a question in person right now.
Go ahead.
So I'm just going to get that.
Mr. Kennedy, thank you very much for coming today, and it's an honor and pleasure to hear you, particularly when you speak of justice. I have a question and a quick comment. My question is, do you agree with me that the right of whistleblowers to be protected from repression is a fundamental pillar of American democracy?
Sir, thank you. What's your name? Where are you from?
My name is Afra Siabi. I teach American politics here. I brought my students here to listen to your politics in action, but unfortunately they had to leave because of other classes. But the reason I'm asking you that, Mr. Kennedy, is that I'm a former Harvard whistleblower, and I took Harvard to the US Supreme Court and lost 5-4. And not only that, I've also been for over 3 decades subjected to Harvard's revenge. I've written a book with the blurb by Mr. Mike Wallace, a friend of your family, I suppose, that says Mr. Afrasiabi has been wrong. Harvard's canons are lined up against a pea shooter. I have a copy of this book for you that I would hope you would be able to read. But very quickly, one of Harvard's many evils done against me has been to bring repeated misconduct against me. One of that was when you were a prosecutor in Cambridge District Court. And I was falsely accused, the case was dropped. I filed my accusers and Cambridge in the federal court in Boston, settled out of court with them with a letter of apology. However, I came to your office And I said, Mr. Kennedy, I'm a professor. They're accusing me of sending texts and so forth. If you show me one text, I will plead guilty. You never paid any attention. You came to court and repeated what Harvard wanted. And I'm really sorry to say this today because I really admire you. I admire your work. Your father came to the center that I ran back in the mid-1990s.
Okay, sir, can you get to the question, please?
And my question is, will you help me end these 3 decades of Harvard's repression just because a whistleblower over Mr. Salman Rushdie was praised me in his autobiography, Joseph Anton, because
Thank you.
I blew the whistle on Harvard's ties to the opponents of Mr.
Thank
Rushdie.
you for your question, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Happy to chat afterwards and happy to take a copy of your book and see what we can do. Thank you.
Okay. We have another question. Go ahead.
Yes, we do have another question.
Welcome, and I appreciate your comments. I'm Professor Tony Vandermeer, Africana Studies Department. I really appreciate your comments about Mississippi and how we begin to deal with democracy and the issues of governance and so forth, and your analogy of Chokwe Ntar Lumumba, who is the mayor, and the budget, the money they gave him based on what the need is. How do we begin to address those disparities, not just in Mississippi, but even at UMass Boston, for example? You know, whereas in some ways, I feel like Mississippi is in UMass Boston. And being in the Africana Studies Department, we feel the same way, that instead of being funded or invested, we're being disinvested. You know, we just had our chair removed right in the mid-semester. We had searches that were canceled because the provost felt that it was important for them to do likewise along with the dean, versus having a conversation with us in terms of engaging in democracy.
Questions brief?
What I'm asking is, how do we begin to deal with not just contradictions in Mississippi, but how we deal with contradictions where we are? Because if we're teaching people, how do we teach them about what's happening outside and don't teach them about how do we deal with problems right here when you see racism right on this campus? It comes from a white supremacist leadership on campus.
Thank you.
Because you talked about white supremacy, right? So did it go away, or is it still here, and how do we continue to address it?
Thank you, Professor Vanderveer.
Professor, I appreciate the question. Look, I think it is 100% critically important to be able to engage with the leadership of this institution and the leadership of UMass writ large about the funding, a couple of things, right? One, the funding, but two, the curriculum and opportunities that are provided to the students and the faculty, right? And if what I think you and I share is that there needs to be ways where there's accountability throughout that system. Leadership is going to make decisions one way or another. We can debate whether that is, and I'm not endorsing any position here, limited resources, people can make a decision one way or another, but there has to be a metric of accountability and transparency in that process. And the extent to which there isn't, that process needs to be absolutely reformed and folks held to account. I'm not as fluent, candidly, on the details of what has transpired here, obviously, as you are, but I'm happy to have a conversation with you again afterwards to see if, to get your thoughts on that. But I think without question, that those principles need to be upheld.
All right.
But thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you. Did you have another one?
Hello. We do have a question on Zoom, and we also have one in person.
Go ahead.
We'll have the one in person first.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome to McCormick and welcome to UMass Boston, Mr. Kennedy. My question to you is, do you feel that the rise of populism in certain parts of the world is threat to democracy? And if yes, then how do you feel that US as a leader, as a global leader, needs to play its part, to address that threat and to assure there is social justice and to protect democracy? Thank you.
And what's your name, sir, if I can ask?
My name is Nadeem Hussain. I'm first year PhD in public policy student at McCormick. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Nadeem? Thank you. Look, it's a great question. I think populism, as I tried to indicate in my talk, populism stems from a frustration of the fact that government isn't delivering on a need for its people, which is what animates a populist fervor to begin with, right? And so I think there needs to be a message received from the governing structures there of saying, hey, if we are a democracy, you are supposed to respond to the will of the people, and if you're not responding to a basic need, you need to be held accountable. And what happens far too often is that governments then respond by repressing those individuals or that movement rather than addressing it and trying to build and grow with that movement. And so do I see populism as a threat to democracy? No, right? I think populism and democracy have to go hand in hand because democracy at its core is about harnessing through representation the will of its people. What does have to happen is that you have to, I think, have those in a position of governance that are responsible enough to understand that and to adjust the structures of government as best they can to address those needs. And at least how I view a bit of this period that we are in at the moment, I don't know how many places around this country I quoted the Declaration of Independence saying that we all are created equal, right? That we meant rich white men when it was written. That we didn't mean you and me, right? It meant rich white Protestant men, right? That was who was contemplated in that we. For the United States, I believe that each generation's responsibility is to try to expand that definition of we. Who is included in that term, right? And I think a lot of the structures that you are seeing at the moment, the tension that you are seeing, is that you have a rising political voice from sectors of our society that were just cut out for far too long. And through measures of technology and other pieces, I have an ability to hold systems to account, right? Which on the one hand is great, right? In a sunlight and a disinfectant to the ills of society. And on the other hand, there's a double-edged sword, right? I don't think social media is necessarily always making our debate and discourse healthier, right? So how do we navigate through that? By then recognizing that the structures as written and as designed weren't as inclusive as we perhaps thought they were or they were intended to be, looking back on them with rose-colored lenses of history. But then being confident enough to say, okay, if we believe that to be true, then you have to reinvent them. And you have to reincorporate them. And we have to do better to be more inclusive in that. And I do believe there's a role in the United States for setting that example going forward and not taking one by saying, hey, if there's a structure here if there's a populist movement because the people of Mississippi are saying we shouldn't have sewage on our lawns, that the appropriate response is to try to somehow find ways to further disenfranchise the people of Mississippi. Right. Do I see populist movements around the world that are, a consequence, even here, a consequence of massive societal changes, economically, demographically, culturally? Yes. Does that mean that those forces are, does it mean it's challenging? Of course. Democracy is not easy. But you have to go through that process. And in that process, if that is a healthy and nurtured space, with those institutions that are, consistently updated, I do think that's the way you navigate through it, rather than somehow thinking, one, it's going to just go away, because it's not. Because at its core, you're talking about basic human dignity, and you can't sweep that under the rug. You can't turn away from that for long enough where people are somehow going to ignore it. Right? No one can, no one will, no one should.
Are there contradictions in populisms, though, and does that create a tension for your democracy model from the ground up? For example, is Black Lives Matter populism equal to Oath Keepers populism, for example? And how do you sort of tease out the contradictions?
So the way I tease out the contradictions might be different than a member of the Oath Keepers, but the way that I would do that is recognize that so populism by definition, I mean, you can look at a Trumpian MAGA, Make America Great Again movement, that I don't agree with their description of the problem, their aims, their objectives, or otherwise. Do I understand, at least from my perspective, that a lot of that populism is centered on a rapid shift of American society culturally, economically, and demographically, that some adherents of that movement, not all, don't want to paint with total brushstrokes here, but feel that that's erodes their station or way of life, or contradicts what is somehow going to infringe on their community, their home, the way in which they define themselves and their identity. That is, I think there's a valid critique of that. Mm-hmm. The solution that has been promised by, I think, former president to adherents of that is just false. It is not what he says is going to be an answer to those challenges is not an answer and will not deliver an answer. Right? This country has gone through massive transitions before. One of the big challenges at this point is, there were a lot of people that made a living driving a horse and buggy. The horse and buggy doesn't go so well anymore. But that transition, industrial revolution, took 80 or 100 years to work its way through society. The one we're in at the moment has happened far more quickly, and so the pain of disruption is far greater. Right? So you don't have the time to adjust that we've had to adjust in the past. That doesn't mean that the solution to that is just ignoring cultural or technological change. You can't, I don't think that's a feasible answer. What it does, I think, is to say, okay, part of that populist fervor comes from a ideal of how do I provide a space for my family, for my children, and without validating the concerns of saying, hey, the way to do that is to solidify systemic racism. That is not the answer. The way to do that is to say, okay, well, let's find ways that you can leverage the most innovative, wealthy, powerful country in the world to actually care for its citizens. And if you can do that, and we can do that, but if you can do that, we can address it. It doesn't mean everybody's going to be happy. It doesn't mean everybody's going to love the solution. But you know what? That's why you got to vote. And you can take my idea for it, or you can take somebody else's. And you get to vote somebody in or out. But I do think that that's so not all populist forces here are, I think, have, in my eyes anyway, the same level of legitimacy. I think their goals or projected perceived injustices should be validated and taken into account. What it does mean is, given the challenges that we're confronting, how do you try to integrate that into a system that does end up providing a pathway forward for us all?
For everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have one last question. We don't want to discriminate against the online Zoom participants, and so we have one question from our Zoom participant, and Jayden will read it.
Hello. The last question comes from Ya Opoko. Her question is, why start a new initiative rather than promoting and strengthening programs that promote protection for democracy and environmental issues?
It's a great question, and thank you for it. The reason why I started this one is I don't believe, and we didn't see any organization that was doing this work, and doing this work this way. There are organizations, obviously, that are doing environmental work. There's organizations that are doing democracy work. My experience from serving in office, running for office, for at least my perspective on the building of civic infrastructure that is needed and necessary in order to build and sustain these gains, there's no entity, I believe, that is working in these places to do this work. And let me give you one example, right? So you've got organizations, whether they're national organizations, Sierra Club, World Wildlife Foundation, League of Conservation Voters, so national ones, local ones, Greenwood's Chelsea, and others that are focused on either environmentalism or environmental justice, and they do incredible work, right? Full stop, period. Supporter of theirs and wholeheartedly endorse the efforts that they all have built from a national platform for some of them to the hyperlocal for others. The challenge is that if you're going to try to do that in Mississippi or Alabama, one, there's not as, while there are certainly environmental justice organizations working there, there's not as many of them as there might be here in Massachusetts. But two, you don't have they can work on an issue. If you are going to work to try to change the structures by which, that set the laws, that set the incentives to a system, you need to have a governance and a governing structure that is responsive to it, right? I don't think that a stronger, and I mean no dispersions here, but a stronger League of Conservation Voters chapter in Mississippi is necessarily going to force Governor Reeves to allocate the funding that is necessary in order to do this, right, to address a water crisis. What you need to have is a level of civic engagement and discourse that is a consistent dialogue that does not end on election day, where if it is just based on politics, your staff gets fired on a random Wednesday in November instead, right? Like, that's a bad way of going about building change. So it is based on continuing to hold people to account. It is based on a continuing dialogue with your citizenry and with your government. And that's not the focus of a Sierra Club, and that's not the focus of even a Democratic Party or, a Democratic Socialist Party or a Republican Party. That's not, party structures are almost by definition focused on a party outcome at an election. They should be focused on that infrastructure piece because that's how you win an election, but that's not how the incentive structures are built. And so there's, as at least I conceived and understand that framework and those issues, there are organizations that are doing great work topically. There aren't kind of going at it and addressing it the way that I think needs to be addressed in the long term.
Well, thank you
Madam
so
Dean,
much,
thank you.
Joe Kennedy III. I, for one, am so glad that you are doing your work this way. Really appreciate your spending time with us today at Umass Boston's McCormick School. Thank you for the interview earlier, and thank you for your address today. Thank you very much, and happy birthday again.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
We've got another keynote speaker, our alumna, Dr. Sudeshna Chatterjee. And so I'm inviting our student success manager and undergraduate advisor, Chris Graham, to introduce her. Come on up.
Thank you, Dean Edozie, and thank you those of you who have stuck around with us in this typical fantastic Boston weather. Hope you're staying warm. So I have the great honor of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Sudeshna Chatterjee. Sudeshna is the Director for Equity and Social Justice for the town of Reading. Her role involves facilitating important community conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as serving as a critical resource to the town, schools, and broader community. Sudeshna is a scholar practitioner in the field of human rights, social justice, and inclusive governance. Sudeshna also served as adjunct faculty in several educational institutions in the Boston area, including Lesley University and Babson College. Sudeshna is an active member in several service and networking initiatives in higher education, such as the Racial Equity Task Force at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She's also at the Boston University Center for Anti-Racism Research, and she's an affiliate of that network program. She's also involved in the Massachusetts municipal government, serving in different various occupations and areas such as Massachusetts DEI Coalition and the Human Rights Coalition. She is a PhD from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And from our Global Governance and Human Security program at McCormack. Let's give it up for my batchmate and cohort mate, Dr. Sudeshna Chatterjee.
Thank you, Chris. This feels like a reunion of sorts. So I'll keep this short because I know all of you probably had a really long day, and I thought I'll just open it up. Do a little bit of storytelling, tell you about my journey. Since 2014, Chris and I are the third cohort of this program. Very proud. I was just telling Stacy and our team, lovely team over there, how I've always considered myself to be like a program ambassador, but we have so many of us now, which is great because that means the program is thriving. So I'm currently the inaugural Director of Equity and Social Justice at the town of Reading in Massachusetts, and I received my PhD in Global Governance and Human Security in 2021 from Umass Boston, the McCormick School. Very happy to be here today. Thank you so much, Kiki, for this opportunity, and to Chris and the entire team for putting this together. This takes me back to like 2014 when I was on the other side of the podium and was like nervously trying to network around, meeting and kind of talking to my cohort mates who now after what, like 8-9 years, are some long-lasting friends. I wasn't sure what would be helpful to our student body here, so I thought I'd do a little bit of kind of sharing my lessons through the doctoral journey and how I practice and adapt that on a daily basis at my current role. I grew up in India. I'm an immigrant, and I came here as a student. I was always a nerdy kid growing up, and as far back as I can remember, I always wanted to go to grad school, get a PhD, be an academic. And so academia always had that kind of draw for me, and I landed up here in 2014. Prior to UMB, I got a bachelor and master's degree in political science from a university in India, the University of Calcutta. And over the course of my doctoral education, I had the opportunity to serve as adjunct faculty in a number of institutions in the Boston area, including Lesley University and Babson College. I try to, I'm no longer very active in a hardcore academic environment, but I try to maintain a semi-active publication record just because I love writing. And I'm hopeful that at some point I will come back to teaching because I love teaching. Prior to my current role in Reading, I served as a certified diversity outreach associate for an executive search firm based out of Philadelphia called Opus Search Partners, who had clients in higher ed. So I've had the chance to kind of look at higher ed from various angles and dimensions. So a lot of learning happened in grad school, a lot of learning growing up, and then 2020 hit. So I thought I'll start off by sharing some of my key takeaways over the course of my grad education. For one, and very importantly, relationships and friendships. Like I mentioned, I was an immigrant. I came here. I have absolutely no family. In the United States, I didn't have family, and while you might think like grad school is difficult, imagine doing that without any social support. But I think I was very fortunate to be kind of landing in the McCormick School. Our faculty were incredibly supportive. I think I saw Jane on Zoom, and a shout out to her for being probably one of the best advisors I've come across, who very quickly became my family. Developed some lifelong friendships and relationships with my cohort mates, which carried us together through a very difficult 2020 to 2021 academic year as well. And taught me some really important valuable lessons that I practice on a day-to-day basis at my current role around collaboration, teamwork, and very importantly, allyship, non-competitive allyship. Another thing that specifically has been kind of my learning mold that I've come into is creating that balance between adopting transferable skills and combining that with subject matter expertise. So a lot of us come into grad school hoping to be subject matter experts. Like I mentioned, I was always a nerdy kid. I always had a very academic, theoretical orientation. A lot of my publications continue to be in the space of political theory and philosophy. And so naturally, my aspirations kind of lay on the academic side of things. And then 2020 happened, and life as we knew it just kind of toppled upside down. 2019 was also the year when I took a break from teaching, and I moved to Texas to be with my now husband, then fiance. And my plan was just to sit and write my dissertation and enjoy the sun, and I was so happy to be away. And then 2020 was just a year of sorts. living in Texas. But I think in hindsight, it was a really good time to take that space and time to kind of self-reflect. And I think we were doing that as a country and even worldwide. It did serve to be a pivoting point for me, especially as someone who's always thrived in mission-driven kind of organizations and contexts. And it was also the year when I eventually got involved with the McCormack Racial Equity Task Force. And I think for the first time, I started to see beyond theory and look at and get interested in organizational change. And once I decided that maybe I wanted to kind of step out of my academic comfort zone and explore new opportunities, that brought a new wave of anxiety because I didn't know how to do that. And so I went back, I spoke to people, I spoke to very many faculty members at Umass and beyond. And I think I began to think about how the doctoral education that we get here in McCormick is incredibly powerful because it equips you with these transferable skills that you can take beyond academia and apply to wherever you want, combined with your subject matter expertise. So that took me to my first non-academic job, which was at Opus Partners. And it was a little surprising. I was very nervous about stepping outside, but I had the good fortune of working with an incredibly supportive leadership team. And I still remember my boss, my previous boss, when he was interviewing me, said that, your doctoral education is like project management. You have it all. You engage with stakeholders, you practice critical thinking, you reach across the aisle, you are process-oriented. So all of those skills have been very important in my journey stepping out of the McCormick School. My job at Opus was very interesting. It entailed helping clients in higher ed, ranging from, and I've worked with Ivy Leagues like Harvard and Dartmouth, right till public research universities like UT Austin, where my role was to help clients kind of integrate a DL lens into their workforce development, hiring, and retention plans. And it was an eye-opening experience for me as well to be looking at higher ed from outside of it, and it was a great experience. Which brings me to my third lesson, if you will, third takeaway, and kind of segues very nicely into my current role, which is critical thinking and kind of imbricating that with anti-racism work from the ground up and doing that through a diversity, equity, inclusion lens. I think Joe was amazing. He touched on some really relevant problems that we don't have to go all the way to Mississippi to say it's right here in Massachusetts. Change is hard. At the heart of diversity, equity, inclusion is change management. So that's where I'm at right now. And I think the McCormick School is incredibly powerful in equipping all of us, all my friends and me, with critical thinking analytical skills that are increasingly becoming really important in the workplace. So I am the first Director of Equity and Social Justice for the town of Reading. This position came about, was being debated since 2017. So it took a while, and I think 2020 just kind of galvanized it, and there's been a lot of municipalities around Boston have these new positions now. And it's difficult because even in a blue state, even in a state where our senators and our governor and all our political leaders are extremely supportive, like Joe was saying, we see that the system is specifically designed to exclude certain people. So trying to work through the organization to include people then becomes immensely tough, but I'm very excited to be in this role. We have a relatively new, incredibly supportive peer members in the town of Reading, our town manager, our school superintendent, so it's incremental, slow change, but it's happening very surely. I was just telling Kelly, I think, on any given day, my life is a confluence between, being Leslie Knope, Parks and Recreation reference, and kind of running around town trying to get things done. But it's also very rewarding. I think it's one step forward, two steps back, but it's the forward element that keeps me going back to that. So my current role, like I said, it's a new role, and it was strategically placed in the Reading Public Library, but it's an overarching kind of shared service with all town departments. And there are 4 pillars that my role has kind of come into. So the first is identifying community learning goals and implementing that through community events and programs. And that can range from one-off celebratory events like Juneteenth to more sustained kind of staff training, workforce development ideas, and more sustained kind of consistent programmings offered through the schools, through school curriculum, or through the public library. The second element of my job, which I personally enjoy the most, is acting like an internal consultant, advisor for our departments. I work with everybody, starting from the town manager to law enforcement, our chief of police, civil rights officer, our school superintendent and his team, and it's a really expansive role, but there are some really interesting initiatives that we are starting to work on, including affordable housing. Reading is a really interesting town. It is 93% white, but it is a commuter town. And it has problematic history, but it's a town in transition. The demographics are rapidly changing, so that's definitely the context that we are constantly grappling with as well. The third element of my work is definitely relationship building. I think, to paraphrase a friend, this is not my quote, DEI work is the work of love. So it's very relationship-based, it's very person-based instead of being very specifically organizational-based or top-down. So on any given day, I'm sitting in the Cafe Nero in the town of Reading, meeting people, trying to cross the bridge and doing some informal mediation to create that community buy-in. And the fourth pillar of my job is networking, information sharing, and gathering information about peer comparable towns. So like Chris mentioned, I'm very active in the Massachusetts DEI Coalition and the Massachusetts Human Rights Coalition, where we kind of have an internal network to kind of share information about challenges, concerns emerging in other municipalities and how they've been able to navigate it. And so I bring that information back to our town leaders and equip them with that. So that's about it. It's been an incredible journey, and it's really good to be back. I was back, I think, a month back to meet with Kiki, and it just feels really surreal. It feels like I have brain amnesia. I don't remember anything from, before 2020. But I'm right here, so if you have any questions, happy to answer that. And I hope your experience at the McCormick Graduate School is as enriching as mine was. Thank you.
Can Jayden come up and join me in moving on to the next phase of this? And if you wanted to make some comments, now is the time. 1 minute comment.
Thank you, Dean Edozie. Hi, everyone. My name is Jayden Panvo. I am a second-year PhD student in Global Governance and Human Security, and I am also the student chair of the Dean's Office of Student Success, the DOS Ambassadors Program. The DOS Ambassadors Program brings together a group of student volunteers who are very dedicated to supporting, promoting, and representing the McCormack Graduate School. Okay, so the MGS Student Ambassador Program, it increases the students' voices by facilitating the diverse representation of our student body at McCormack, in the McCormack's governance, which is very critical to how we learn. And as ambassadors, we support the initiatives, programs, and workshops put forth by the Dean's Office of Student Success. I would like to highlight how this September, the DOS student ambassadors, along with our advisors, Christopher Graham and Dean Edozie, have founded the McCormick Scholars Club. The McCormick Scholars Club is now a registered student organization here at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And the McCormick Scholars can be any of you. They are the current students who demonstrate a keen sense of leadership and a desire to further the success of the fellow student colleagues at McCormack. They represent different programs and cohorts across McCormack. And the main purpose of this club is to encourage and facilitate student success through community engagement. Finally, I would like to take this time to wish our Jewish community who could not be here with us today, who are hopefully some who have been able to join over Zoom, Happy New Year. And I really recognize the importance of this time of deep reflection and time of fasting and prayer. We look forward to having our Jewish community in future McCormack events. So Thank you very much, Dean, and thank you to the professors, the staff, and all my cohorts and my classmates. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayden. Great partnership. Chris, I think we might want to move along.
I just wanted to highlight two things. I think the faculty already know some of this, or some of the faculty was at our last retreat, but we are putting forward a couple programs which we're basically extending different aspects of DOS. And the main one, or main two that I'll talk about is the DOS peer-to-peer platform, and that will be initiated through the McCormick Scholars program, where graduate students help to mentor our undergraduate students as a part of that process of getting them, acquainted with graduate education and probably eventually joining our program, right? So it's a big part of that is student recruitment, and then also student retention. And then the other part is to build out our co-curricular engagement, where we allow students to attend events like this for extra credit. And we're going to send out a survey that will get the information from faculty as needed, and we'll build that out for you in the future. Right. Thank you.
And many other programs. Thank you, Jayden, and thank you, Chris. And so now we wanted to do this differently, so I'd like you to stand up and walk around and do the meet and greet part by especially the new students visiting our different knowledge tables to get a better sense of, what it is we do and our activities, our curricular programs at McCormack. I'd like to thank the faculty, the program staff, and the program directors for collaborating with us, in this effort. So we've got the DOS ambassadors table over there, right? Yes. The DOS ambassadors is now an organized group called the McCormick Scholars. That's a first, for us at McCormick, and it represents, I think, we've got a great history of public service and public engagement, but we have to put student success, at the forefront of our activities at McCormick, and, we're beginning this partnership to do that. So thank you. To the ambassadors as well. Department of Public Policy and Public Affairs is here. We've got Jack Lee, who has been patiently sitting there. Thank you, Jack. And Program Director Heather McCandle, who is the PhD in Public Policy Faculty Director. And Michael Johnson is the MPA Program Director. And I think I saw Laurie and Zai Jefferson, who is the Center for Women in Politics and the GLPP program and center director. So your table is right there, you're where you are, so people can move around. We have the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security and Global Governance. Kudos to Department Chair, Fearless Leader Stacy Van der Veer, and his also fearless leader and partner, Kelly Ward Mason, who is the program administrator for the program. And that's their table right there. Department of Gerontology is here. I see Professor Jeff Burr is with us. Good to see you, Jeff. Since your sabbatical and since the pandemic, I don't think I've seen you for a couple of years. So it's good to see you, and thank you. Thank you so much for coming. And Ellen Bachanda, who is the program director for the MAS program, the master's program, and Jim Hemmenbreck, who is the director of the OLLI program. So their table is right there. Please visit them and join them. The Africa Scholars program is fielded by program assistant Balkisa Diallo and our new colleague, who is the Faculty and Curriculum Affairs outreach person, and that is Augustine Abel. So the table is right there. Global Affairs, BA Online. We have many undergraduate students who joined us online earlier. Is that right, Chris? And Denise Sharif was online as well, so she is virtually online representing the program. And don't forget our centers and institutes. There are many. I just want to quickly read them. Director of the Center for Governance and Sustainability, Center for Peace, Democracy and Development, the Gerontology Institute, and the Center for Social and Demographic Research on Aging, our Center for Social Policy, our Edward Collins Center for Public and Municipal Management, the Center for Women and Public Policy, our Joseph Moakley Chair of Peace and Reconciliation, and Parag O'Malley was here. It was great to see him. The Leading Age LTSS Center, the Massachusetts Office of Public Collaboration, and the OSHA Lifelong Learning Institute, directed by Jim Hummelbrecht right here, and Tabor is the Director and Managing Attorney of the Pension Action Center, and even though Sustainable Solutions Lab is not a McCormick Center, it's an affiliated center, and that is directed by Rebecca Hurst. You know, thank you and welcome. You know, I think, you know, McCormick is a jewel. You know, when you learn about its history, there's no wonder that we are what we are today, right? You know, just really this incredible, very differently structured public affairs and policy program that, you know, on the one hand has these really excellent academic programs, but we would be nothing without the way in which we deliver them in an engaged, outreached, you know, way, which is embodied by, you know, many of the activities we've had today. So please, let's use the last 5 minutes to, you know, circle, don't sit on your own table, go to another table and just learn about, you know, the college, and we'll come back in 5 minutes for closing remarks with Jayden and Chris. All right, thank you.